What if the most famous author in the Forgotten Realms was also its least trustworthy? Volothamp Geddarm, Volo for short, is a name that shows up all over Faerûn. He's the author of some of Dungeons& and Dragons' most iconic in-world books, Volo's Guide to Monsters, Volo's Guide to Waterdeep, and even Volo's Guide to Baldur's Gate. But here's the thing. Nobody in the realms can seem to agree whether he's a scholar or a menace. He's been banned from cities, cursed by wizards, hunted by monsters he poorly described, and discredited by none other than Elminster himself. And yet, somehow he keeps showing up, quill in hand, ego fully intact, ready to embellish whatever tale he's tangled up in next. In this video, we're diving deep into Volo's actual history, canon from novels, adventures, and supplements spanning multiple editions. We'll trace his path from failed magical scholar to best-selling travel writer, and eventually, well, let's just say being turned into a frog by Elminster is not the worst thing that's ever happened to him. This is the full, official story of Volo. Warts and all, let's get into it. Volo's earliest years are deliberately vague, even by realm standards. He seems to have been born somewhere in western Faerûn, though not much is known about his family, childhood, or how he first became obsessed with fame. What we do know is that Volo was always a seeker of knowledge and an even bigger seeker of, well, attention. Originally, he claimed to be a scholar of the arcane, and his first known major work was an ambitious and reckless project titled Volo's Guide to All Things Magical. It aimed to collect, describe, and rank powerful spells, artifacts, and magical theories across the realms. Sounds useful, right? Not to the people he wrote about. Elminster himself called the book misleading, dangerous, and deeply irritating. And other archmages were not so kind. Several magical factions issued death threats. At least one wizard cursed every copy of the book so that reading it aloud would cause spontaneous nosebleeds or worse. In the realms, writing about magic without a license is like poking a beholder in the eye. Volo had made enemies. He learned quickly if he wanted to keep publishing, he'd need to write about things less likely to get him polymorphed. That magical misstep taught Volo an important lesson. There's more gold and far less danger in writing about taverns and troll caves than spellcasting circles, so he pivoted. Volo rebranded himself as a travel writer, folklorist, and chronicler of the real Faerûn. The version you'd see from the back of a cart or across a tankard in a noisy inn. And to be fair, he was a talented writer. His flair for storytelling, eye for colorful detail, and complete lack of shame made his books wildly popular. And so began a string of in-universe guidebooks that quickly made Volo a household name. Volo's Guide to Waterdeep, Volo's Guide to Cormier, Volo's Guide to the Sword Coast, and more. They were full of practical advice, curious anecdotes, wild exaggerations, and unverified claims. He claimed to have outwitted vampire lords, dined with dragons, and once described the mating rituals of trolls in a little too much detail. His critics called him careless, his fans called him entertaining. Either way, he sold copies. Of course, the guides were full of half-truths. Volo rarely stayed in one place long enough to do real research. He'd often make assumptions, pad stories with local gossip, or simply write what sounded most exciting. In some cases, he stole other people's discoveries and took credit for them, hoping nobody would notice or survive to contradict him. But he wasn't just hiding behind the quill. He did travel, he did face danger, and often he barely made it out alive. Despite his many flaws, Volo attracted powerful allies, chief among them Elminster, the Sage of Shadowdale. Now, ally might be too generous. Elminster treated Volo like a mildly annoying mosquito. Too small to crush, too persistent to ignore. But Elminster occasionally provided editorial notes in Volo's books, correcting his more outrageous claims and occasionally insulting him in the footnotes. Their relationship was famously strained. Volo admired Elminster, but constantly misquoted him. Elminster tolerated Volo, but only just. The two butted heads often, but their back and forth helped sell even more books. Volo was controversy incarnate, and that suited him just fine. As Volo's fame grew, so did his reputation. He was banned from cities like Silvery Moon and Baldur's Gate for reckless reporting. He once barely escaped Calimport after revealing too much about a noble's secret smuggling ring. In Waterdeep, he was temporarily imprisoned for libel, but charmed his way out by writing a glowing review of the jail's meat pies. To some, he was a nuisance, to others, a national treasure. But love or hate him, everyone read him. By the time of the second and third editions, Volo had become more than just an author. He was kind of a myth. His guides had expanded across the continent, each filled with strange encounters, tavern recommendations, and bizarre footnotes that may or may not have been true. He reported spotting a beholder disguised as a chandelier, claimed to have shared brandy with a mind flayer, said he once seduced a dryad and lived to tell the tale, although barely. But for all of his exaggeration, Volo did stumble upon real threats. In some adventures, he accidentally uncovered cult activities, dragon plots, and extraplanar schemes that others had missed. He rarely understood what he was witnessing, but his blunders sometimes served a greater good, usually by alerting someone smarter to the danger. That blend of accident and audacity kept him in print and kept him alive. Of course, for all his flair, Volo wasn't just publishing travel guides, he was building a brand. He released book after book, Volo's Guide to Waterdeep, Sword Coast, and Cormier, positioning himself as the most well traveled, well informed expert on anything and everything in the realms. But his reputation was, to put it kindly, controversial. Nobles and shopkeepers sued him for misrepresentation. Mages chased him out of towns for revealing trade secrets that were either dangerously oversimplified or outright false. Even adventurers who found themselves mentioned in his books often wanted nothing to do with him, especially when he got their names or achievements wrong. Still, Volo had a strange kind of plot armor. His charm, sheer audacity, and frequent alignment with powerful allies, particularly Elminster, meant that he always seemed to land on his feet, or at least somewhere nearby. That said, not all of Volo's mishaps were minor. At least one of his guides caused genuine catastrophe. Volo's Guide to Baldur's Gate 2, a very real publication in both our world and in universe, revealed enough political and magical details to accidentally assist spies, criminals, and extraplanar agents. It was quickly pulled from circulation, and according to lore, copies of it are now incredibly rare. In fact, some scholars claim that Elminster himself arranged to have the remaining copies destroyed to prevent any further harm. Then there's the case of Volo's Guide to the North, where he famously claimed to have stayed in a haunted inn overnight, only for a party of adventurers to later discover the entire building had been abandoned for over a decade. It wasn't haunted, it had collapsed. Volo had simply gotten lost, passed out in a nearby ruin, and hallucinated the entire thing after drinking what he later described as herbally suspicious tea. His exaggerations were a constant source of tension with Elminster. The sage of Shadowdale spent decades anointing Volo's work with sarcastic corrections, magical footnotes, and in some cases full on magical redactions. But while Elminster grumbled about Volo's distortions, he never truly shut them down. Maybe he realized that Volo served a purpose, not as a scholar, but as an entertainer, a gateway into the realms for common folk and adventurers alike. But even for Volo, things eventually took a turn. By the time of the events of Waterdeep Dragon Heist, Volo's career had started to fade. His books were still popular, but his credibility, never very solid to begin with, had worn thin. His latest project, Volo's Guide to Spirits and Spectres, had been indefinitely delayed after a public argument with a necromancer who allegedly tried to curse him during a book signing. So instead, Volo turned to more personal pursuits. Which brings us to the case of Floon Blagmaar. Volo had hired the party, your party, if you've played Dragon Heist, spoilers ahead if you haven't, to track down his friend, a man named Floon, whom he believed had gone missing after a night of drinking. But of course, nothing with Volo was ever that simple. Floon hadn't just wandered off, he'd been mistaken for a noble heir and kidnapped by agents of two rival criminal factions. The rescue mission quickly escalated into a citywide conspiracy involving the Zentrum, the Xanathar Guild, and a vault full of embezzled gold. And through it all, Volo mostly stayed to the sidelines, safe, loud, and wildly unhelpful. When the dust settled, he couldn't even pay the adventurers their promised reward. Instead, he offered them the deed to a crumbling tavern, Troll Skull Manor. Depending on your DM, it was either a generous gift or yet another dodge. But one thing was absolutely clear: Volo's talent for getting in over his head hadn't gone anywhere. Still, in his own way, he always seemed to bounce back. After the Dragon Heist affair, Volo began working on a new edition of Volo's Guide to Monsters, featuring even more questionable insights into creatures like flumps, mind flayers, and beholders, many of which he claimed to have encountered personally. One memorable entry describes beholders as not entirely without charm. Once you get past the disintegration rays and paranoia, it's unclear whether Volo actually interviewed a beholder or just drank with someone under a polymorph spell or something and decided it counted. That was Volo's gift, and his curse. He blurred the lines between truth and tale so thoroughly that even he may not have known which was which anymore. And while scholars and sages raged against his inaccuracies, the common folk adored him. His books were accessible, often hilarious, and on rare occasions surprisingly useful. He was the bard of the printed word, the unreliable narrator in a world of grim facts, and whether he meant it or not, he captured something vital about the Forgotten Realms that, beneath all the danger and darkness, there's still wonder. And sometimes the best way to understand a world like Faerûn is through the eyes of a fool who loves it. Volo has never been just a simple traveler or writer. His relationship with the magical elite of Faerûn, particularly Elminster, is complicated, deeply intertwined, and essential to understanding his survival and ongoing adventures. On one hand, Elminster had acted as a protector and occasional rescuer of Volo. When Volo published his infamous guide to all things magical and revealing dangerous and forgotten spells, many powerful wizards sought to punish him for exposing their secrets and vulnerabilities. These mages saw Volo as a reckless danger to the fragile balance of magical knowledge. Without Elminster's timely intervention, it is unlikely that Volo would have survived the wrath of sorceresses and warlocks and wizards who aimed to curse or permanently transform him into various lowly creatures, toads, dung beetles, or worse. But Elminster's protection was never unconditional or free from reprimand. Instead of outright destroying Volo for his foolishness, Elminster often chose more subtle and sometimes cruel forms of punishment. At times, he trapped Volo in magical imprisonment spells that froze him in stasis for decades, transforming him into a frog or even a stone ornament, leaving him helpless and completely unaware of the passage of time. This was as much a lesson as it was a penalty, meant to teach Volo the dangers of meddling with powers he did not fully understand. Yet, even this harsh treatment came with a degree of mentorship. Elminster, as well as other legendary mages like Kelvin Blackstaff Aronson or the symbol of Algorand, were not simple adversaries, but occasional guides. They understood that Volo, while reckless and sometimes exasperating, possessed a unique role as a chronicler and storyteller. They tolerated his mistakes because his writings, as imperfect and sometimes unreliable as they were, brought stories, knowledge, and warnings to the wider world. Their exasperation was not unfounded. Volo's curiosity often led him into dangerous situations, sometimes ignoring the warnings or magical curses placed upon him. For example, after his first guide to all things magical, Volo was cursed by various spellcasters so severely that he vowed to avoid exploring magical secrets again. But inevitably, the lure of forbidden knowledge pulled him back. This blend of protection and punishment created a complex dynamic. Elminster and other mages saved Volo's life multiple times, but only after teaching him hard lessons about humility, discretion, and respect for magic. Their guidance shaped Volo's approach to his work, pushing him toward more careful research, while still preserving his vibrant, sometimes reckless voice as a guide and storyteller. Without this intricate relationship, a mixture of mentorship, punishment, and reluctant guardianship, Volo's stories and guides might never have survived, nor would the man himself have lived to wander Faerûn and record his wonders, dangers, and mysteries for generations to come. Volo has survived dragons, mind flayers, angry royalty, and worse, editors. But some of the most remarkable truths about him are ones he doesn't even fully understand, or even at all. You see, buried in the footnotes of arcane theory and half redacted letters from Elminster himself, Volo is described as not just a nuisance, but as something far stranger, a weave anchor. Now, to be clear, Volo is not really a wizard, sorcerer chosen by Mystra, or even a particularly good student of magic. But according to Volo's Guide to All Things Magical, a book that Elminster personally anointed with heavy scorn, Volo has, though through sheer exposure, become someone the Weave recognizes, someone it remembers. In realm speak, the Weave Anchor is a living being around whom magic flows more cleanly. They don't cast spells or channel power, but their presence helps stabilize the Weave, the invisible lattice of magic that suffuses all reality. Think of it like a stone in a river. It doesn't control the current, but the flow bends around it, patterns form, and ripples emerge. And no, Volo is not chosen by Mystra in the way that Elminster or the Seven Sisters were. He is not one of the chosen. There's no divine appointment, no mandate, no gifting of supernatural abilities. Rather, Volo became an anchor by accident, it seems, an oddity the weave seems to cling to out of familiarity, not reverence. Over the years, Volo has wandered through ancient Netherese ruins, spent time in places soaked with mythical energy, witnessed spell plagues up close, and brushed shoulders with beings infused with world altering magic. According to Elminster, this repeated exposure has left an imprint. The weave, semi sentient in its own way, has latched onto him, not as a champion, but as something akin to a magical lightning rod. This strange connection doesn't grant him magical powers, but it might explain how he's survived so many disasters. It could be why wards sometimes fail around him, or why wild magic seems to right itself when he's nearby. Some mages speculate that Volo unconsciously grounds magical energy, bleeding it off like a circuit breaker. Others suggest the weave finds him amusing and chooses to preserve him for its own unknowable purposes. Elminster, typically tight lipped about magical theory, has confirmed that spells of protection, memory alteration, and even compulsions have been layered onto Volo over the years. Not all by his own hand, and despite what Volo believes, not all of them have worn off. Some protections may still be functioning, humming silently beneath his oblivious exterior. If nothing else, this may explain how a man who insulted drow matrons tripped through active portals, and once touched an artifact touched by the Netherese is still very much alive and somehow still talking. So is Volo destined for something greater, or is he an accident of some magic? Or the universe's idea of a practical joke? Either way, the Weave remembers him, and in the Forgotten Realms, that alone makes him more than just a man with a quill and a big mouth. In the later years of his career, Volo was nothing short of a lightning rod for chaos. Somehow, his knack for surviving it only added to his notoriety. In the years following the publication of his most successful works, Volo found himself traveling even farther from the Sword Coast. One such journey took him aboard a ship named the Vigilant, bound for the hidden nation of Samarak on the Chultan Peninsula. The voyage didn't go smoothly, because of course it didn't. During the crossing, he narrowly escaped death after being distracted by a pod of dolphins and abandoning his soup. A crewmate ate the bowl instead and died of poisoning. Even when he wasn't trying to cheat death, fate seemed determined to brush right past him. Things only got worse when a ferocious storm shipwrecked the Vigilant on the shores of Samarak. Local Batari goblins immediately attacked the survivors. Volo, thinking he could defuse the situation with his flawless command of the goblin tongue, attempted diplomacy. It did not go well. The goblins responded with steel rather than conversation, and a bloody skirmish followed. By the sheer fortune, or perhaps Time Morna's amused blessing, Volo survived and was escorted to Samarak's elite guards in the city of Samargal. Despite the city being closed to most foreigners, Volo's old business associate, a merchant named Sensani, vouched for him. She even recruited the surviving adventurers as employees of her trade company, giving Volo just enough cover to begin researching what would become Volo's guide to the Serpent Kingdoms. That's when things took a darker turn. Sasani and her entourage were being infiltrated by Yanti of House Sasahin, who were plotting to take a takeover of Faerûn through economic manipulation. One of her aides turned out to be a Yanti pureblood. When the truth came out, Volo and the rest were forced to flee through a hidden planar portal back to the Sword Coast. Volo, ever the dramatist, thanked the adventurers for saving his life by gifting them a magical rejuvenation ring, a rare moment of sincere generosity. But there was a twist. At some point during their time together, Sasani performed a blood magic ritual on Volo. This was to limit his vulnerability to intoxication and help him function more effectively in their endeavors. But secretly, it would magically bound the two of them together, the full implications of which Volo may never have fully understood, or more likely refused to acknowledge. Still, he pressed on. He published Volo's Guide to Good Rulership, further expanding his genre into political advice, and just as always, he did this while evading his many enemies and creditors. Living proof that being banished from half the continent doesn't mean you can't make money off the other half. Of course, it couldn't last. While working on his guide to Cormier, Volo had attracted unwanted attention from Elminster again, this time for writing nonsense about the Sword Heralds, a group of mysterious mages. Elminster famously threatened to rename the book Volo's Guide to the Effects of an Imprisonment Spell on the Victim, written from personal experience. Eventually, Elminster did make good on that threat. Volo was trapped in an imprisonment spell, caught in a state of magical stasis. Depending on the account, he may have spent time as a frog, a stone ornament, or a stone ornament of a frog, sitting at the bottom of Elminster's garden pond. He would remain trapped there for at least 18 years, possibly half a century, until after the events of the Spell Plague. That timing, as usual, was incredibly convenient or suspiciously well placed. When the Spell Plague erupted, Volo's stasis prevented him from being affected, and according to some sources, he may have served as a minor anchor to Mystra's weave, preventing the worst magical backlashes from affecting the area. Whether he knew this or not is unclear, but it might have been the only time Volo's presence ever helped stabilize anything magical. When he finally emerged from magical suspension, decades had passed. The world had changed, the weave had been torn and reforged, gods had died and returned, and entire regions had fused with Toril. Volo had missed all of it. Elminster tried to explain what had happened, but by his own account, Volo understood very little of it. He re entered the world like Rip Van Winkle, older, unchanged, and completely out of sync with the new realms. And yet, within a few years, he was back to writing again. Somehow. Despite missing decades of realm shaking history during his magical imprisonment, Volo emerged from stasis completely unbothered. If anything, he was refreshed. The moment he was free, he did exactly what anyone would expect from a man who once tried to catalog every type of in room chair in Faerûn. He started writing again. He would soon make one of his most memorable appearances in Waterdeep Dragon Heist, the official 5th edition adventure module set in the City of Splendors. By this point, Volo had taken to describing himself as a humble chronicler of wonders, and had already completed his guide to monsters. He had just begun researching a new book, Volo's Guide to Spirits and Spectres, a guide that Elminster once again attempted to suppress, citing its reckless commentary on necromancy and the undead. After the events of Dragon Heist, at that point, his fame, or infamy, had reached across Faerûn. In 1490s, stories about him could be heard from Waterdeep to Baldur's Gate, where he makes yet another notable appearance, albeit in a very different form. In Baldur's Gate 3, Volo can be found as a minor companion earlier in the game. He's just as flamboyant and theatrical as ever, introducing himself in the third person, eager to chronicle your journey as the centerpiece of his next best-selling guide. He's once again tried to embed himself into the events far beyond his control, believing he can document history by standing just close enough to it without getting burned. Of course, in the process, he ends up captured by goblins, and he even attempts to extract the player's illithid tadpole with an ice pick. And if you're unlucky, or lucky, and trusting him enough to let him try, he may actually succeed in removing your eye and then replacing it with a magic one. It's a very Volo outcome, and yet somehow the fans love him, I love him, because beneath the arrogance, exaggeration, and endless self-promotion, there's a kind of charm to Volo that few other characters in the Forgotten Realms possess. He's one of the only figures to survive every edition of the game, not by being a god or chosen or a master wizard, but by being entertaining. Through him, we explore cities, monsters, cultures, and histories that might otherwise go unnoticed. And when we read Volo's Guide to Monsters, we're not just looking at a stat block, we're hearing the opinions of someone inside the world who might be very well wrong, but is never boring. His unreliable narration is part of the realms itself. His influence can be felt whenever Dungeons & Dragons leans into the idea that knowledge is messy, subjective, and often ridiculous. Volo may never be the hero, but he's a chronicler of heroes, and sometimes that's the more dangerous job, because while the swords swing and the spells fly, Volo's the one taking notes, usually from a safe distance, preferably with a drink in hand. Thanks for joining me in this deep dive into the life and adventures of Volo, one of the Forgotten Realms' most colorful and enduring characters. From hapless scholar to infamous chronicler, Volo reminds us that sometimes the story isn't about being the hero, but about telling the story. If you enjoyed exploring Volo's world, stay tuned for more lore, character histories, and deep dives into the realms you love. And if there's a particular character or topic you want me to cover, drop your suggestions in the comments below. And while you're there, if you feel so inclined, like and subscribe. Until next time, keep your dice rolling, your stories unforgettable. This is James from the Dungeon Puffin. Later, guys.
Trat!